Welcome again to another session of the 17th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. I'm Bob Hales, and I'm still your moderator. We have with us today Lauren Barbeau. She's the Assistant Director in the Center for Teaching and Learning at the Georgia Institute of Technology, the Rambling Wreck. And she's the co-author of Critical Teaching Behaviors, Defining, Documenting, and Discussing Good Teaching. Yeah, that sounds interesting. Her mission is to change the way higher ed talks about and assesses teaching. She earned her PhD in English and began her educational development career at Georgia Southern, and there was the assistant director for faculty development at University of Georgia. Wow.
Mhm.
Georgia's on your mind, I see.
Georgia's on my mind. Yeah,
Yeah.
it wasn't the plan to
He's
end up
gonna
moving around Georgia, but
Laura's
life.
gonna talk about foundations of success, defining critical teaching behaviors for student learning. Lauren, take it away.
Thanks, Bob. So for those of you who might have just entered the room, I'm going to give you just another second to think about this question, and I really do want you to drop it in chat. That's not a joke. I really do want you to drop it in chat. So this session is designed to be a workshop, which means it's not very interesting if you don't interact with me. It's a lot more fun for all of us if you respond to the prompts. So we're going to use what you put in the chat. I thank Carol and Carolyn for dropping their responses in chat. If you're just joining, please do go ahead and put your response to that in the chat. So, as Bob said, we are here to discuss foundations for success, defining critical teaching behaviors for learning. This is based on the work that I've done on critical teaching behaviors, the book that I've co-authored. And this, again, is designed to be an interactive workshop. So, get ready to interact. There's me. Since it's a very small screen, you might not actually be able to see my face. This is the best headshot you will ever see of me. And it's probably the picture I'll be using for the next 30 years, even when I stop looking like this. But for those of you who want to put a face with a name, that's me, and there's my name, and there's my contact information if you'd like to follow up with me. We talked about how some of you define student success, which we talked about students reaching their goals. Typically, when faculty respond to this, I see things that are along the lines of they're able to pass my course and do the things that prepare them for the next course. They achieve the grades. They have the skills they need. They meet the learning outcomes for the course. What I find interesting about most faculty definitions of success and why I appreciate Carol and Carolyn's responses is that faculty define student success by skills oftentimes or outcomes that we want students to reach. Makes total sense, right? That's what we're assessing, and that's what we know matters for their future success. But students define their success pretty differently. They overwhelmingly, according to this 2022 EDUCAUSE report, overwhelmingly define their success as completing a degree, followed by securing a job. So for us, critical thinking, skills development, transfer of knowledge, all of these sorts of things matter to us as their faculty, and they should matter to us. However, if we're talking to students, our metrics for success can seem like they're at odds with student metrics for success, especially if we're thinking about this from the student perspective. Now, we have another layer to definitions of success, and that layer is the institution. Our institution's definition of success can differ even more from students' definitions and from ours. In some senses, I think the institutional definitions of success might actually be better aligned with students because our institutions want to see that students are finishing their degrees, right? So, how do we reconcile these different definitions of success and make sure that we're teaching in a way that fosters student learning towards their definition of success, as well as our own personal definitions of success? Well, that means we need to know what success looks like to our students so we can communicate our sense of value, our sense of success to them in a language that's going to make sense. So if we're trying to communicate why something matters to students, thinking about that in terms of how it's going to help them be successful in completing their degree and securing a job in their future, those are two key elements in getting students to identify why something matters. How do we do that though? How do we teach for this kind of learner success that aligns with our definitions and student definitions and institutional definitions? Well, I'm here to introduce the critical teaching behaviors framework, which is what I spent years of my life co-authoring and developing. You're busy people. I get that. You don't have time to go out there and become experts on teaching and learning. That's a full-time job. In fact, it's mine. There are people who do that. But the whole point of the critical teaching behaviors framework, which Bob, if you could drop the link to make a copy of that framework in chat, you can scan the QR code or click the link in chat. The entire point of this framework is to help you become an expert quickly on what research says matters for effective teaching practices. So the critical teaching behaviors framework defines instructional practices to create a shared understanding. We want to create an understanding that spans disciplines, spans institutions, spans roles, faculty, student, administrator, of what good teaching is. And it does that by providing a concise synthesis of research-based teaching behaviors proven effective for improving learning. What does that mean? Let's unpack that for a second. So to build this framework, what we did is we went out and we did research on student success and teaching behaviors that promote student success. In terms of what mattered to us in teaching or learning success, we considered learner success very broadly so that we're taking in the perspective of students as well as faculty and administrators. So we considered lowered DFWI rates, which I didn't realize this, but apparently that means different things to different people. So when we talk about DFWI rates, I mean drop, fail, withdraw, and incomplete. We also looked at something that raises test scores or grades overall. But we looked more long-term too at increased retention or time to degree rates. We looked at a greater sense of belonging or student well-being, as well as improved sense of self-efficacy and student motivation. On the other side of things, the side that really matters to us as faculty, we also looked at gains in critical thinking skills and long-term retention of concepts. We also looked at improved performance beyond higher ed and within higher ed. So this gives you an idea of the very broad net that we use to define learner success when we went out, we built this framework of what critical teaching behaviors are. This broad definition allows us to incorporate a variety of teaching practices that support different aspects of learner success to align across different definitions. So we are using a diverse set of teaching behaviors to support student learning. Now, I see that Bob has dropped that link for me. I'm going to pause just so that you have time to review it and ask questions. This is a small group. If you feel comfortable unmuting, go for it. If you feel uncomfortable, go ahead and drop your questions in chat. I'm open to either one. But this is me stopping talking now. Right. It's always odd when you're in the online context, not able to see and get that nonverbal feedback. You may still be looking at the framework, and if so, that's all right. You can continue to drop those questions, but I'm going to give a brief overview just to make sure that you looked at it and that you're not off in TV land checking email right now. So the critical teaching behaviors framework consists of 6 defined categories of behaviors. So 6 different categories. And these are those categories. We'll talk about this diagram in just a second. You've got the 6 categories that are in the rows, and then you've got 3 columns. So the first column is the behaviors themselves. The second column is representative behaviors. Now, we can't put every single behavior on here. If you want more information on behaviors in a category, you can find that in the book, as well as information on how to implement them. The last column focuses on what sorts of documentation you can collect as evidence that you are engaging in these behaviors. That's not what we're here to talk about today, so we're going to largely ignore that column. We are going to spend some time today looking at the first two columns. Now, this is a really big project that has a lot of different arms. It has an entire section on gathering student feedback, collecting feedback from peers through peer observations, and gathering your own reflections on teaching as a form of documentation. But those are not the things we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to talk about critical teaching behaviors from the perspective of student experience. I want to take a moment before we move on to look at this diagram that's on the screen. So if you were able to access the framework, you'll see lovely, neat, color-coded boxes. So nice. But that's not what teaching looks like, right? The act of teaching is messy. It overlaps. Sometimes it's unclear which category something fits into. And as we were building this framework, we realized we need something that captures that messiness. Now, this framework, this image that you're seeing probably doesn't capture that messiness as messily as it could or should. But what we did come up with is that the four center behaviors, assess, integrate technology, include, and engage, are the things that you're more likely to see when you walk into a classroom. Align and reflect behaviors are very hard to see in action, and unless you're doing something to intentionally document them, they can go unnoticed when we talk about and think about our teaching. However, there are also the behaviors that tend to drive the strategies that we select in the four inner categories, right? You align your assessments with the ways that you're engaging students, for instance. You select technology that fosters the kind of engagement or assessment that you want to see. And of course, we can't get better at any of this unless we're reflecting on our teaching regularly. So that's what's holding our teaching universe together. Might not be what's holding your teaching universe together, and that's okay. Any questions about the framework itself as we move into the next section of this workshop where you're going to work? Okay. So let's find out what you're going to be able to do by the end of this session. By the end of this session, I hope that you're going to be able to reconcile definitions of student success that you might hold as an instructor with student definitions of success. Hopefully, you're also going to be able to define critical teaching behaviors. You should, you have the handout. And to do that, we're going to analyze some case studies to identify the impact of critical teaching behaviors on learner success. So you're really going to start implementing, why are these critical teaching behaviors important? How do they impact student learning and success? And at the very end, I'm going to give you time to plan to implement a strategy that promotes student success. So be on the lookout for what you think might work for you, or something you're already doing that you think, I could do more of that to promote my student success. Again, pausing for questions since we are in the online space. All right, moving on. If you're out there checking email, now's a good time to come back because we've got some homework to do. This is the critical teaching behaviors in practice, the case studies element, and this is where I need you to chime in. In this section, we're going to review a critical teaching behavior category definition. Then we're going to use the CTB framework to identify and discuss instructors' behaviors. And then we're going to report out on behaviors that you identified. You'll be able to share your thoughts in the chat. And we're finally going to spend some time identifying the research-based benefits of behaviors in each category. So the important thing here is that I need you to stick with me, read the case studies, and identify the behaviors the instructor implemented that supported student success. This is where that framework handout that I gave you comes in handy. You'll want to reference the framework handout to decode what's happening from the student perspective and translate that into what the teacher did to make this effective. Sound good? I'll give myself the thumbs up. It sounds great, Lauren. We're all ready to go. All right, kicking off with Align. Instructors who align components of learning experiences start with clear learning goals, measurable outcomes, teaching and learning activities, assessment tasks, and feedback. build on each other to support learner progress towards these goals. That's the definition that we are working with. And here is our case study. I will read it to you. You're welcome to read it yourself as well. Most Bible classes at the university required a large number of textbooks per course. Professor Burge discussed each book individually and told us why she had chosen the book as required reading. From the first day of class, students were encouraged to read our textbooks and to take notes. We were warned of the author's biases and challenged to read critically. Professor Burge made it clear that these textbooks were vital to our understanding of the class, and we would write or be tested on all of them at some point in her or another. Her enthusiasm for the books fueled classroom discussion. So I'm going to give you just about a minute here, and I want you to review this case study. Look at the critical teaching behaviors listed under the align category. What did the instructor do in the align category that supported student success based on this case study? I'm going to go on mute just to ensure that I stop talking long enough to let you think. Does anyone feel comfortable coming off mute to share? Excellent. Thank you, Carolyn. Carolyn says that she sees number 5 in the aligned category as connecting the concepts. Excellent. Yes, this teacher was clearly connecting concepts across texts in the course. Yep, 4 and 5. Excellent. Yep. So they're making connections, they're challenging students. What's interesting here is that the student was not complaining that they were challenged to read critically. They're noting this as a positive, but it's a correct level of challenge. Some of the things that I want to highlight here is that the instructor defined the goals and outcomes for the reading. So if we're decoding what the students had to say, yes, thank you, Carol. When the why is understood, complaints are fewer. Carol, I think you just summarized this case study in a nutshell. So one of the complaints is there are a lot of textbooks, i.e., textbooks cost a lot of money. It's very expensive to be in these courses. And of course, when things are expensive and then the textbooks aren't used, I spent money that I didn't have to spend, and now I'm mad. Have done that, have been mad about that. What this student seems to appreciate is that the why is clear. The why behind having to read the textbooks, why they were worth buying in the first place. So there's clear communication of goals. There's connections across reading. So a bigger picture begins to emerge for students. And there's an appropriate level of challenge. The student isn't complaining that they're over challenged by the reading that they have to do. So those are some of the things that I'm seeing in this case study. Let's take a moment to think about why alignment of learning activities matters. Okay, so when we align things properly, we actually increase student self-efficacy. What does that mean, self-efficacy? Well, we increase students' perceptions of their own competence. Imagine what it would be like if you were blindfolded and walked into a room. Let's say you're going to a classroom on campus to hear a talk that day. And at the front of the room, you're blindfolded and told to walk in and find a seat. Well, maybe you've been to this classroom a million times and you can do that with reasonable confidence. Maybe you've never been to this classroom. Maybe you don't trust the person who's blindfolding you. Think about what it's like for a student to come into our classroom. It's kind of the same thing. We understand the why, we understand the goal and where we're asking students to go and what we want them to do and how that all fits together into a bigger picture, but students don't. And when students can't see the goal, they don't feel like they're capable of getting there. Part of what alignment is telling us to do is to make the goal clear and then decode how we're going to get there through smaller goals and steps that scaffold towards that end goal. And not surprisingly, when we show students the goal, they're much more motivated to try to get there. When they feel like they're able to do it, they try to do it. So if you want your students to put in more effort and you want your students to be more motivated, telling them the why, showing them the goal can help us get there. Are there questions about this particular case study? I want to underscore what Carol said again, that when the why is understood, complaints are fewer. Students feel less frustrated with our teaching and with the learning process. So alignment and clear communication of alignment is an easy way that we can lower frustration for everybody involved in the learning process. But we talked a minute ago about motivation. Let's go to the include category because inclusion actually has a lot to do with motivation. In the include category, we're talking about creating an inclusive learning environment that promotes equity by using accessibility standards and learner-centered strategies when designing and delivering content. Instructors who are doing this cultivate an atmosphere in which learners see themselves positively represented and experience a sense of belonging conducive to emotional well-being for learning. Let's dive into another case study. Before your class, I was terrified of statistics. You were so patient, so kind. And even though I wasn't one of your A students, you never made me feel less than. You were just as frustrated as I was when you knew I knew the answer, and the test anxiety would just get to me. It was your determination and your constant encouragement that made me not want to give up. I left your class with actual knowledge of concepts, and I was no longer scared of the big, bad statistics class. Now in a PhD program, I will be finishing a quantitative concentration next year. Thank you for prioritizing meeting your students where they are. What include behaviors do you see happening in this case study? All right, we're starting to see some responses come in. Thank you, Erica. Seeing number 1. Carol saying number 1, 3, and 5. So number 1 is building community and relational trust. We definitely see that going on here, right? The instructor has clearly made an effort to build that community and trust with the student. And this student is saying that they succeeded because of the trust that the instructor built with them. Also had 2 votes for number 3. So number 3 is using learner-centered strategies in course design and delivery. Absolutely. So this instructor was thinking about the learner the whole way through and making sure that she supported the student in her test taking anxiety. So something else to think about is, yeah, number 5. I think Carol said number 5, removing barriers. Removing barriers here looks like acknowledging that the student has test taking anxiety and making sure it sounds like the student is accommodated or using accommodations. Oftentimes, students don't want to use their accommodations. Sometimes instructors don't want to let them use their accommodations. It sounds like this instructor made sure that the student got them and used them. We can't force students to use them, but we can destigmatize using them for sure. I think something else important to point out here is that the instructor assessed their own biases. So nobody said number six, but I think it's implicit here that the instructor didn't make assumptions. The student was just not working hard enough. So oftentimes when we have students who are not performing in class, we can make assumptions about why they're not performing. I have done this, fully acknowledge that. It's something that I've had to work on over the years. I assume that my students are lazy or disengaged in my content and they're just not interested. One of the things that's made it easier for me to uncover what's happening is use of technology. Allowing students to engage through different kinds of platforms has allowed me to see that not everybody engages in the same way, and I can access the thoughts of more students if I'm allowing them to share their experiences through different media platforms, technology. So technology has really changed the way I think about my students and their performance in the class. But it sounds like this instructor made no assumptions about why the student was struggling in the first place, which I kind of have to give a kudos to. Let's talk for a minute now about what happens when we engage and include behaviors. When we engage and include behaviors, we obviously increase students' sense of belonging. That's kind of the point, and the sense that they're valued. But why does that matter? I mean, obviously, if we care about people, that matters, right? But maybe that's not enough to convince some people to do this. So if it's not enough, let's talk about what happens when students feel valued. They work harder. If you want students to be motivated, if you want them to put in the effort in your course, make them feel valued and cared for. This is true in pretty much any environment. Your work environment, your home environment, your school environment. When you feel like you're valued and you belong, you're much more likely to work hard in that environment. What that means in the learning environment is that students are more likely to stay in your course. Yeah, thank you, Carol. We get engagement, which we're going to talk about engage category next. But include is foundational for engagement. If we want students to engage, we have to make them feel included. If they stay in our course, they're more likely to complete their degrees. Oh, yeah, Carol, thank you. We help them overcome imposter syndrome. This is so true. I've been in higher ed for like 15 years at this point, and I still wake up with imposter syndrome. I've been giving this presentation like so many times I can't remember in the past 2 years now, and I still have imposter syndrome about giving it. If we as experts in our field have imposter syndrome, we think our students do? Yeah, absolutely. And when we make them feel like they belong in the discipline, we help them overcome that sense of imposter syndrome. Yeah, they have it. Thank you, Carol. They do. And that can be a real barrier to their success if we don't intervene. I actually, tangential but related, just heard a story from one of the grad students I'm teaching this semester. I'm teaching a graduate pedagogy course. And she said that as an undergrad in engineering, one of her engineering professors told her she didn't really think she had what she needed to cut it as an engineer. She probably needed to drop out. I hear this all the time. I heard this when I was a trio tutor at the community college from my students, that they were told they were advised to drop out of a course because they weren't ready to take it. I know that a lot of faculty think they're doing a good thing by advising students to drop out. But what we're actually telling students is you don't belong here, and I don't think you can succeed. There are better ways that we can support students to success, like knowing what campus resources are and connecting students with the appropriate resources, which is actually what the instructor in this case study did. Since we brought up the engage category, let's talk about engage. When we think about engage, we think about instructors who purposefully select research-based techniques to ensure that learners actively participate in the learning process and take responsibility for their intellectual development. This is like the ideal of learning, right? This is what we all want to see in our classrooms, students who are taking responsibility for their intellectual development. Well, what we know is that the engaged category can help us get there. So let's think about that from the learner perspective for a minute. I will read aloud this case study to you. The teachers in our biology department are really interested in active learning, and I found that that type of learning really resonated with me. It's very collaborative working in small groups and having lots of discussion during lecture. I had one professor in genetics the fall quarter of my junior year who dedicated so much time to his students and was really clear about expectations and was just the most phenomenal teacher I ever had. At the very end of the quarter, I just walked up to him after the last lecture and I said, "Thank you so much for a great quarter. Are you accepting undergraduate research students?" So now I'm going to give you a moment to decode what's happening in this case study. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, all of them are applied here. This is a good case study, right? Yeah, thank you, Erica. Erica, we see establishing regular and open communication. Absolutely. So number one. Number two, designing course activities to intentionally promote student instructor, instructor, student. Wait a second, I read that wrong. Student instructor, student content, and student engagement. So there's an intentional construction of learning activities here, encouraging participation of all students through varied instructional strategies. Absolutely. Um, no one's saying fostering self-regulated learning except Carol. Carol says all of them. Five definitely seems to be happening here because five is relating course content to relevant examples and applications. So it seems like one of the things I think the instructor is bringing, yeah, students want to do research. If you teach a course that's so engaging that students come up and want to engage in research afterwards, I think you've done a good job at conveying your enthusiasm for the discipline, right? Enthusiasm is contagious. And when we convey that to students, um, that gets students interested. So incorporating the relevant research, absolutely. So this person seems to be bridging the research and application gap, right? So thinking about real world applications as well as research applications, enough to get a student engaged in undergraduate research, which is one of the goals we have at Georgia Tech is getting students engaged in undergraduate research. When we get students engaged, it stimulates their motivation. Passionate people engage in projects simply because they're passionate, not because they have to, not because they're doing it for credit, not because anyone told them they should do it, just because they want to. Think about a hobby you've picked up recently. Most people have picked up pickleball. I'm not very athletic. I picked up embroidery. It's a nice sedentary hobby, right? No one told me I had to do it, but I went out and I watched YouTube videos on how to do it because I was interested and I'm passionate and I want to learn more. When you're passionate about something, you're going to put in the effort. So that leads into motivation. If we want our students to be motivated and again, work harder, stimulating their engagement by transferring our enthusiasm for course materials is one of the most effective ways that we can do that. What's interesting too about engagement is that you're much more likely to think critically when you're engaged. Now, going back to that example I gave of embroidery, I picked this up as a hobby because it was COVID. We were all sitting in front of Zoom a lot, and moving my hands, as you can see, helps me stay focused. So it's a nice thing that I can do, moving my hands while I'm listening or watching. It helps me focus more. What does that have to do with critical thinking? Well, when I ran into a knot I couldn't tie, I didn't give up and walk away. I put in the effort to learn the skill, which meant that I sat there and I looked at these little pictures and I tried to figure out what they were doing and why. And when I couldn't, I went and found a YouTube video. If we want our students to be the kind of learners who encounter a problem and think about it and try to solve it for themselves and go out and find the resources to help them solve it, we need to get them engaged. When they do those things, it ultimately leads to skill development. They're able to do the thing because they invested the time to learn how. And if we're thinking back to the idea of success, which is how we started this presentation, skill development is going to be essential for them to get a job. It's essential for them to transfer knowledge to the next course, and it's essential for them to be successful in their chosen career paths. So we see the importance of engaging students when we're looking at this from the student perspective. Unsurprisingly, of course, when we engage students, they're more likely to earn higher grades. They're much more likely to persist. They're much more likely to stay at our institutions and in our degree programs. This is probably not very surprising. Now we're going to look at the assess category. Depending on where you are in higher ed, assess can be kind of a dirty word. It can be something that's maybe controversial. But when we talk about assessment, we're talking about assessing learning in a way that facilitates transparent, meaningful tasks. We often talk about assessment as dialogue. What that means is that we're giving timely feedback on learning to help students measure the achievement of learning outcomes. Assessment can work both ways. So when we assess student learning, we're thinking about this as dialogue, remember, if we assess student learning to give them feedback on their progress towards the outcomes for the course, assessing students can give us feedback on our teaching as well. If all of the students perform poorly on an assessment, that should give us some data to think about. Maybe that means that we designed the assignment poorly. Maybe that means that they weren't ready to complete the assessment. But assessment data should also help us improve our instruction. So now let's look at that case study. Professor Faluka's use of frequent and constructive feedback made the assignment much more engaging and beneficial. The feedback provided was understandable, digestible, and thought-provoking, as Professor Faluka framed it as a dialogue to help students learn how to improve the project and persist forward. Having numerous opportunities to learn from the feedback was helpful. I would encourage faculty to use a mix of written and oral feedback to provide feedback often and in a timely fashion. So this student is actually giving us some feedback on how we should teach for their learning. Go ahead and let me know what you see happening in this particular case study. Yeah, Carol, thank you. So we see that number one is happening. So scheduling a range of regular summative assessments that are measuring student progress toward learning outcomes. Um, Number two, embedded formative assessment and opportunities for self-assessment. One of the interesting things that's happening here is that the student is really engaging with the feedback that the instructor provided. I think oftentimes we get frustrated giving feedback because it seems like students don't use it. I taught writing for 7 years, freshman writing, and spent a lot of time giving feedback that I think my students didn't read at all. Now, since I taught writing, I've learned a lot of strategies for getting students to engage with my feedback a little bit better. But it's not really useful to give feedback that students don't find understandable, digestible, and thought-provoking. So it's worth thinking about how we give feedback in a way that students find useful. Yeah, so Carol is saying, I enjoy when my students comment back on the feedback thread in their gradebook. Yeah, so there are ways that we can actually get students to dialogue with us about their response to feedback. And this is one of the most effective ways that we can engage students in thinking about feedback. Um, it's important that we engage this dialogue because otherwise, we're giving feedback and we're wasting our time doing that. We want to make sure that we're using our time purposefully. Um, it seems to me like this instructor, as Carol pointed out, communicated the purpose, task, and criteria for assessments. They made it very clear why the student was doing it, what they had to do to be successful, and how it was going to be assessed. And obviously, they were providing that timely, constructive feedback. I would agree, Carol, it's harder to see this from the student perspective, but I do think that the instructor clearly is using the assessment data to make course corrections for themselves too. That's much harder to see if we're thinking about it from a student perspective. But just the fact that the assignments are so well scaffolded and that the feedback is so constructive and frequent suggests to me the instructor has spent many years probably reviewing assessment data and making this happen. And by the way, I do know that technically we've got 5 minutes, but Bob told me we're on lunch break at noon, and so I could go over because no one's after me. So since this is usually like a 75-minute conversation and a real conversation, we might go a little bit over. Um, just FYI, if you have somewhere to be. What happens when we assess our students? Well, here we go with that motivation thing again. Guess what, folks? Have you ever been motivated to learn something because you had a test coming up? I know I have. Assessment does motivate students. Tests are motivating. The testing effect is real, if you've never heard of that. I think that's a concept that's been around in higher ed for a little while now. Students remember things that they're tested on. So, yeah, we need to assess students if we want to motivate them to learn material. Testing actually improves self-confidence. Assessment is important for helping students become experts. So when you are tested on something or when you're assessed, because it's not always just a test, right? Um, when we assess students and they perform well, we start to build their confidence as learners in the discipline. So assessment is important for student self-confidence in the discipline. Now, let's be clear about what types of assessment, though, because high stakes testing, high stakes assessment, not super great for building self-confidence, but really good for getting students to cheat, which is not what we want, right? What we do want is regular low stakes formative assessment. That can take many different forms. But when we do that, those low stakes assessments help students figure out what they do and don't know and where they need to improve to grow. What's really interesting about that is that regular low stakes formative assessment with timely feedback grows students' neural pathways. If any of you out there have read How Learning Works, you're going to know that this is the example from How Learning Works. But if you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. What they talk about in that book is that experts have knowledge clusters. So we may have a point here. We can access it from any of these different knowledge points. Students' knowledge often looks like this point leads to that point, leads to that point. So if you've ever heard students complain that, well, you didn't say this was going to be on the test, you're like, this is the exact same thing. What might be happening is that students don't understand how to access point B any other way than point A. You might have come at it laterally from point D. They can't see the connection between point D and point B because they don't have that neural pathway activated yet. What we're doing when we assess students is helping novices become experts. We're helping them build different ways of accessing knowledge. And that can lead to transfer of knowledge, which is exactly what we want. It's oftentimes what many of us cite as our definition of success for students. Carol is saying the program I adjunct with is focusing more on reflections and assignments to show connections instead of more technical testing. Yes, Carol. This might be called metacognition. I don't know what your program is calling it, but oftentimes reflecting on learning and assignments to show connections is tied to metacognition, which is certainly part of the assessment category. All right, we're coming to the last of the CTB categories that we're going to talk about in terms of case study. We're going to talk about integrate technology. This is our most controversial category. People are like, that's not a critical teaching behavior. I can teach well without technology. I don't know that I have to make a hard sell on this one because we're all in a digital environment. And a lot of the sessions at this conference I've noticed are about online teaching. For us, when we decided what needed to be a category, it was important to elevate technology to this level because, and this was before COVID and before AI, we believe thoroughly that you cannot teach well without, at a minimum, using the learning management system and using it effectively. It doesn't mean you need to use all the bells and whistles, but it does mean you need to have some basic level of how to use your learning management system to design accessible, high quality instructional materials and engaging learning opportunities. Integrating technology is one of the ways that we transcend barriers of place and time, allowing us to be more inclusive in the design of our learning. So let's look at a case study. This is the only one we have that's not positive, which might tell us something about the way a lot of people are integrating technology, right? The biggest improvement I would make is consistent usage of the LMS within all my courses. Some instructors actually use the LMS and some don't. And some use it totally differently. Assignments or slides are often hidden in other places besides the assignment folders, which often make things confusing. Sometimes I have to go to more than one place to find instructions on what I'm supposed to do, which is frustrating. Like sometimes they'll send an announcement about an assignment and then no instructions or a link to the assignment itself. Take a moment to decode what's happening here. It's probably easier to say that none of these things are being done, right? They're definitely not leveraging technology to increase access or facilitate ease of use or optimize the student learning experience. They're not using the technology effectively or efficiently. They're probably not training students to use the technology effectively. And they're probably not considering the pedagogical implications of the technologies they select. So when we talk about selecting technology, we don't mean use all of the newest technology, all the bells and whistles. That is not what we mean. Um, this is from Carol, who's saying, we saw this almost verbatim and have been working to standardize our LMS usage. And no, none of the IT criteria are being hit in the example. So Carol, this is actually my Georgia Tech mission in life, is to try to get everybody using the learning management system and using it correctly. We are using Canvas. For those of you who use Canvas, you'll know that there's a files section of Canvas where if you don't turn it off, you can make all of your files visible to students. Yeah, you're using Canvas too. So you have the same problem. Unfortunately, a lot of our faculty are organizing their courses through the files section, which is really not great. This is why cloud storage was invented. That's not what Canvas is for. In a more recent example, someone actually shared their entire grade book in that area, which is a FERPA violation. So we are trying very hard to get people to move away from using files. But what we're not talking about in this section is using all of the bells and whistles and getting everybody, including yourself, confused. We're talking about selecting pedagogically relevant technologies that enhance instruction. And that means selecting a few technologies so that you're not increasing the cognitive load of your learners. The last session, right before this, was, if you were there, and I know some of you were, she did talk about online course design. And she was talking about making it standardized. The goal is to reduce student cognitive load so that they have more mind space for learning. If students have to spend all their time trying to figure out where to find things in your course, their cognitive load, like what's going on in their brain is focused just on figuring out how to navigate the technology, which means by the time they find the thing they need, their energy has been sapped. They don't have as much brain space available to focus on the act of learning itself. So, good online design reduces cognitive load and makes it easier for students to focus on learning, which is, after all, what we really want. When we use our technology effectively, as so many of you who are teaching online understand, we increase access. Students who didn't have access to education before now have access. I don't have the citation for this, but I did see something interesting, a study that said almost all students now have access to a mobile phone. Not everybody has access to a laptop, but they have access to a phone, which means we need to be designing with mobile phones in mind, right? Something else to know about using technology is that it can promote understanding. Remember how I said I got into embroidery as a hobby recently? Well, I can't for the life of me understand the little diagrams they give me. They give you these pictures with some written instructions. And if you've ever tried to read that, and if you can understand that, please email me because I want to know who you are. I don't understand what in the world they're trying to tell me. But if I go Google a YouTube video, I got it. Most of the time before they even finish the video, I've got it. Now imagine what that would be like for students. Imagine if we gave them multiple means of accessing information. This doesn't mean that students have preferred learning styles. What it does mean is that when we give them multiple modes of engaging with content, it reinforces learning and can help them deepen their understanding in important ways. And the last thing we'll talk about here in technology is how using technology can promote professional success. So I work with a professor who teaches finance. Imagine what it would be like if that finance professor said, it's not my job to teach you how to use Excel. In fact, I don't even want to focus on Excel. We're going to do this in ledgers because there's other stuff that's more important than learning to use Excel right now. Her students wouldn't be prepared for their careers. Everybody in finance is using Excel. They need to know how to use Excel. She needs to incorporate that into her course, even if she doesn't think that one of the stated goals of the course is to learn to use Excel, which might be meaning it's time to revise the learning outcomes for the course, right? But using technologies that are relevant to the field are very important to promoting student long-term success. So as to bring this to a close, we're going to touch on the last critical teaching behavior category, which is reflect. And when we talk about reflect, we're talking about ourselves, not our students. So this is a category that talks about gathering feedback on our teaching. And there are three different ways we can collect feedback on our teaching. We can do that through self-assessment or reflection. We can do that through peer feedback, and we can do that through student feedback. When we do that, it allows us to identify opportunities for growth as well as our strengths as teachers. When we see what we're good at and where we want to improve, we can pursue relevant professional development and engage with scholarship that helps us get better, deepen our strengths, and ultimately support student success more effectively. So let's put that into practice. Reflection allows us to make meaning out of experience and turn thoughts into behaviors. If you're here and you followed along with me, hopefully you got something out of this session that you're going to be able to turn into a behavior. What specific behavior or behaviors will you implement after attending this session and how? I would really love to see that in chat. This is one of those ways that I self-assess that I got my point across. I've also read research that setting an intention or making a plan can help you be more effective in actually doing the thing. So this benefits all of us. Right. I would love to see your reflections as you drop them in. Thank you. I'm working on how the differences between Trio Canvas usage and the business academic courses I teach can be improved upon. Thank you for that one. As we bring this to a close, I want to point out that we have a lot of materials that we've built out to help you do exactly what we're talking about, reflecting on your teaching. If you would like access to those materials, go ahead and scan the QR code or put that bit.ly in your browser window. Bob, I do believe I shared the bit.ly link earlier somewhere up at the top of the chat if you'd be willing to drop that in chat again for me. What you'll find in this folder is printable full color files, including the CTB framework that you should already have access to. Peer observation materials, if you're interested in peer observation, that is our next project. So we're expanding into that frontier. And you'll also find mid-semester student feedback materials if you're interested in collecting data on your students' experience in your courses so that you can learn what success means from their perspective. I do thank you for being with me today. It's been a pleasure to present at this conference, and thank you, Bob, for the invitation. Please enjoy your lunch break.
Thank you, Lauren. That was great stuff. I really appreciate it. Good, useful things for everyone. So have a good rest of the day. And some of you, I'll see you at the next session in about an hour.